As a child, I grew up loving Walmart. I mean, to most people, it's just a store, but to a kid, it's a place to look at a bunch of shiny new things. So I loved it when my mom would take me with her when she would go shopping there. Not only did she spend hours out at a time, but she knew I could behave, so I basically got to spend most of the day looking up and down the toy aisle and at the electronics. It was a blast when I didn't have anything else to do. It's amazing to think that just one bad experience can change your entire outlook on something like that. Nowadays, I don't even like the idea of going into a Walmart. You see, when I was 11 years old, I had gone with my mom to the store, and it started out just as fun as ever. I made my way to the back of the store, where they kept all the bikes and scooters, and first I began to look at the skateboards. However, after a few moments, I ended up doing as I always did and made a straight line to the toys. They had just come out with a new line of Power Ranger toys for the new series, and I was really excited to get the new Megazord toys for Christmas. But until then, looking at them in the boxes would hold me over. The feeling of joy that I got from being surrounded by toys would change really quickly that day after a tall and heavy-set man approached me in the aisle. He asked me if I needed help with anything, which I thought was odd because he wasn't wearing a Walmart vest. But I just told him, "No thank you, I'm just looking." I expected him to leave shortly after, but instead, he just stood next to me for a moment. I looked over to him one more time, and that was when I knew that things were serious. He looked down at me and asked me if I knew where my parents were. I didn't know what to say. My mom had warned me about strangers, so I knew to be on edge. I eventually responded by saying, "Yeah, she's just a few aisles over." I turned to put the toy back on the shelf and began to make my way out of the other end of the aisle. "Have a good day, sir," I said, but as I turned to wave, I could see that he was slowly beginning to follow me. My only response was to begin to run as fast as I could. I didn't know what it was, but something was telling me that I could not let the man get close to me. I didn't stop to look back. I just kept running. I made my way into the clothing section of the store, but I stopped dead in my tracks. My heart was pounding so hard that I swear it was making my chest move. Somehow, the man had managed to make it to the other end of the clothing department before me. We locked eyes. I had no idea what I was going to do. He began to step a bit toward me when all of a sudden a woman stepped into the aisle. She had a baby in her cart that she was pushing as she began to browse the clothes. I didn't hesitate. Something in me told me that I could trust her. I walked up to her and calmly said, "Hi, Mom. I've been looking all over for you." The lady was puzzled at first, but once she saw the man at the other end of the aisle turn to walk away, I think she understood the situation. All she did was nod and smile. She ended up walking me to the customer service center, where they got in contact with my mom. After telling the store what happened, the managers ended up looking at the security tapes and noticed that same man who followed me around had been in the store 4 times that week. All of them, he was just lurking in the toy aisle. They think he was waiting for someone young and alone like I was. We never went back to that Walmart again. A few years ago, while I worked as a local exterminator, I got a call from the local Walmart. I spoke to the manager, and they said that overnight, a raccoon had wandered into the store, and they thought it was sleeping in one of the small crawl spaces that could be found in the back of the store near the ventilation. I didn't have anything to do that day, so I told them I would be there in an hour, and I got ready to head out. My plan was to catch the raccoon and release it in the woods nearby. I had a cage and bait that I've used countless times, and it almost always worked. So I figured the job would be no problem. I made it to Walmart, and a few of the employees directed me to a small hole that appeared to have been busted out of one of the walls in the storeroom. The hole was about 2.5 feet wide by 2 feet tall, so it was just big enough for the cage. Before I walked back to the car for the cage, I wanted to make sure that we got the right place, so I originally planned on just poking my head in and looking for signs of the little guy. However, I couldn't see anything, so I decided to take it a step further. I got down on my hands and knees and began to pull myself into the wall. To this day, I still have no clue what I was thinking doing that. It's one of the dumbest things I have ever done. I made it into the wall, and once inside, there was just enough room for me to squeeze my way through, and I didn't have to go far before I began to see raccoon droppings. I called back to let the Walmart employee know that it was the right spot and that I was coming out. To my horror, not only was there no response, but I was now hearing a loud whirling noise. Then it was dark. I couldn't turn around because it was too narrow, but I began to feel around with my foot. The hole that I had crawled in had been covered by something. I immediately began to panic. It was pitch black and I could hardly move my arms and legs. I screamed and screamed for what felt like days. There was no way to tell how much time was passing in the darkness. It wasn't until hours later that I heard the whirling noise again and saw a light come in from behind me. I didn't waste any time and immediately began to slide myself out. As I made my way out of the small hole in the wall, I was met by a manager who was extremely apologetic. Apparently, an employee who didn't know I was back there had placed a pallet of produce in front of the hole, and since I didn't bring my equipment back there, they didn't know anyone was stuck. I was in the wall for 3.5 hours before the manager realized what must have happened and got someone to move the pallet. I tell you, I'm glad I don't have to crawl into tight spaces with critters anymore. I was working the overnight shift one night at Walmart. I was on their processing team. We were in charge of receiving the shipments at night, making sure everything was processed right, and then sometimes we would stock the shelves if we had time. One night, I'll never forget it. We had finished unloading all the trucks, and it was the time of the night that my manager would let me take my first smoke break. It wasn't company mandated, but he would let me go out and smoke a few cigarettes during my shift because he knew I got my work done. Anyways, I was outside the loading bay, and I noticed a dark sedan parked on the side of the lot. Now, I didn't think anything of it at the time. It was actually pretty normal. Kids from high school would come back there late at night and do whatever they wanted, whether it was smoking a little weed or spending time with each other. They usually didn't cause problems, so we didn't care. So I just continued smoking. But as I stood there, I could have sworn that I heard a muffled screaming. But again, I tried not to pay attention to it. I figured I would mind my business and let whoever continue whatever they were doing. As an 18-year-old, I just assumed it was two people getting a little weird behind the Walmart. So I quickly finished my cigarette and went back to work. A few hours had passed, and it was now around 2:30 in the morning. This was when I typically take my second smoke break. When I went outside, I immediately noticed that the car was gone. At first, I figured that was a good thing, but as I looked closer, I noticed there was a bag sitting in the spot where the car had been parked. I walked up to the empty parking spot and immediately knew what had actually been happening while I was smoking. Besides a small purse that was sitting near where the car was, there was a small amount of blood that seemed to be trailing toward the edge of the lot near the tree line. I couldn't bear to check for myself, so I immediately called the police. After they arrived and got a closer look at the scene, they told me that they did indeed find a body. It was that of a young woman who had been stabbed more than 20 times by the looks of it. I quit that very next day and have been in and out of therapy since. I can't seem to wrap my mind around the fact that I witnessed such a heinous act and just brushed it off because I thought it wasn't anything serious. I constantly lose sleep over the thought that I could have done something to help out. Remember, sometimes things aren't always what they seem.